I want to be upfront with you before we get into this. These aren't campfire stories. They're not creepypasta. They're not something somebody's cousin's friend made up on a Reddit thread at 2 in the morning. These are real accounts, sent in by real people who went into the woods and came back changed. Some of them still don't talk about what happened. A few of them haven't been back outside a city since. I don't have explanations for any of this, and honestly, I'm not sure I want one. Let's get into it. I do a solo backpacking trip every September. Have for about 6 years now. My family thinks it's reckless. My therapist thinks it's healthy. I think it's the only time I actually breathe. Last fall, I drove up into the Flathead National Forest in northwestern Montana. I'd done a section of the trail near the North Fork before, but this time I pushed further in, past the trailhead crowds, past the designated campsites with their little numbered posts, into the kind of country where you don't see another human being for 3 or 4 days. And that's exactly the point. The drive up was fine. Long, but fine. I turned off Highway 2 onto a Forest Service road around 5 in the evening. Rutted gravel, dense lodgepole pine on both sides, no cell service, standard. I parked my truck at a pullout near a creek crossing, got my pack in order, and was on trail by 6. I planned to hike it about 4 miles before dark and pitch camp. The first 2 days were everything I needed them to be. Cold mornings, clear sky, the kind of silence that has texture to it. I saw mule deer on the second afternoon and a pair of ravens that followed me for about a mile before losing interest. I slept hard both nights. No issues. The third day is when things started to feel wrong. And I want to be careful about how I say that. Not wrong like something jumped out at me. Wrong like the air changed. Like the forest got quieter than it should have been and stayed that way. I noticed it around midday. I'd stopped on a ridge to eat lunch and fill my water filter, and I realized I hadn't heard a bird in probably 2 hours. No wind either, which is unusual for that elevation. I told myself the weather was turning. There was a pressure system moving through. According to the forecast I'd checked 2 days before, and I packed up and kept moving. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I know how that sounds. Everyone who spends time in the backcountry knows the feeling. Your brain scanning for threats, catching movement in your peripheral vision that turns out to be a swaying branch, a shadow. That's normal. This didn't feel like that. This felt directional. Like something was keeping pace with me off to my left, just inside the tree line, at a distance of maybe 40 or 50 yards. I stopped 3 times and listened. Nothing. No crashing of underbrush. No snapping twigs. Just that heavy, pressing quiet. I made camp early. Pitched my Nemo tent on a flat section of ground near a dry creek bed, got water before dark, cooked and ate quickly, and was in my sleeping bag by 8:30. I told myself I was tired. I told myself the feeling would pass. I woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of someone crying. Not an animal. I've heard foxes, I've heard elk calves. I've heard the sounds the mountain makes at night that'll make your hair stand up. This was a human voice. A woman, I thought. Low and rhythmic, not hysterical. More like someone who'd been crying for so long it had become automatic. Distant enough that I couldn't make out anything, but close enough that it was real. I lay completely still for a long time. My heart was going hard in my chest. I had a bare canister and a knife and a headlamp, and none of that felt like enough. After maybe 10 minutes, it stopped. I didn't sleep again. At first light, I broke camp in about 15 minutes, and I moved. I hiked out in one push, 8 miles, didn't stop except to drink. When I got back to my truck, I sat in the cab with the doors locked for a long time before I started the engine. On the drive back down the Forest Service Road, I passed a section where someone had pulled a vehicle over into the brush, not parked, like they'd veered off or stopped fast. The driver's door was open. There was nobody inside, nobody around. The vehicle had Montana plates. I don't know how long it had been there. I called the Lincoln County Sheriff's Dispatch when I got back to Cell Range. They said they'd send someone to check. I never found out what they found. I stopped looking for news about it after a while. I think part of me knew that if I found something, I'd have to figure out what to do with that, what it meant about the sound I heard, and how close I'd been to it. I haven't been back to that part of the Flathead. I'm not sure I will be. I worked as a fire lookout for the BC Wildfire Service this summer before I started grad school. If you've never heard of the job, it's exactly what it sounds like. You live in a small tower on top of a mountain, sometimes for weeks at a time, and you watch for smoke. Coordinates were logged, radio checks ran twice daily, and your nearest neighbor was usually the next lookout tower, which could be 15 or 20 miles away through absolute nothing. My tower was in the Ominica region of British Columbia, north of Prince George. I want to say it was beautiful up there, and it was, in the way that things that can kill you are beautiful. Big sky, the whole drainage below you, caribou on the ridgelines in the early mornings. I had a good radio, a propane stove, a stack of paperback novels, and about 12 weeks ahead of me. I was 23 years old, and I thought I was exactly the kind of person who could handle that kind of solitude. I still think I was. What I couldn't handle was what started happening in week 6. It began with the radio. Lookout towers communicate on set frequencies. We checked in at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Between those times, the radio was mostly quiet, occasional traffic from forestry crews, weather updates, the odd call between dispatch and a helicopter. I knew the voices on that channel. After 6 weeks, you get to know voices. One night around 11, I heard a voice I didn't recognize. It was using our frequency. The signal quality was decent, not perfect, but not garbage either. The voice was male, I thought, though there was something off about the register. It was reading numbers. Just strings of numbers, 5 digits, a pause, 5 more digits, over and over. No call sign, no identifying information, no response to my check-ins. I logged it and reported it the next morning. Dispatch said they hadn't heard anything and suggested it might be bleed-through from another frequency. Atmospheric conditions can do strange things with radio signals up at elevation. That made sense. I accepted it. It happened again 2 nights later. Same frequency, different numbers. Longer this time. I timed it at just over 4 minutes. When it stopped, there was a pause of about 10 seconds, and then a single word. I won't write it here. I'll say it wasn't English, and it wasn't French, and I've had people listen to my recording of it since then, and nobody has been able to identify the language. A few people said it didn't sound like language at all, more like language shaped by something that had only ever heard it from a distance. I told myself it was shortwave interference. I told myself that a lot. The physical stuff started in week 7. Small things at first, the generator running 10 degrees hotter than normal, with no apparent cause, the propane pressure dropping overnight when I hadn't cooked. Then one morning I looked out through the alidade, the big rotating sighting instrument in the middle of the cab, and I saw what looked like a person standing on the ridge to the northeast. At range, it's hard to tell. I put my binoculars on it. It was standing completely still. The caribou I'd been seeing all summer typically moved constantly, heads down. This wasn't moving at all. It stood there for the better part of an hour. I checked on it every few minutes. Then it was gone, and I couldn't tell you which direction it went because I didn't see it move. I asked dispatch about trail access to the northeast ridge. They told me it was unroaded, no designated trails, no scheduled forestry operations in the area. They didn't sound concerned. I tried to match their tone. The last week I was there, someone knocked on the door of my tower. Not the lower door at the base of the stairs, the door of the cab itself, 60 feet off the ground, at the top of the outside catwalk. I was asleep when it happened. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. I lay there in the dark for a long time without moving. Then I turned my headlamp on and looked out the window. The catwalk was empty. I have thought about that knock every single day for 3 years. I've come up with exactly one explanation that satisfies the skeptical part of my brain, and it requires a very specific set of atmospheric and structural coincidences that I don't actually believe in. My contract ended 4 days after that. I drove back to Prince George, ate an enormous meal at a diner on Central Street, and called my mother. I didn't tell her any of this. My name is not important. What's important is that I've been hiking the Colorado backcountry for almost 20 years, and I know the difference between a bad feeling and a real one. What happened in the San Juans 2 summers ago was real. I was 3 days into a solo traverse through the Weminush Wilderness, starting near Silverton, moving southwest toward the Needles. High alpine terrain, serious country, 13,000 feet in places. I'd done sections of it before. I had a full kit, a Garmin InReach for emergencies, 7 days of food. I was comfortable. On the first day, I signed the trail register at the Pine River Trailhead. You know the ones, those little metal boxes bolted to posts at the start of backcountry routes. You're supposed to write your name, your start date, your planned exit, and your party size. I wrote mine, flipped back through the previous pages out of habit. I always do this, like checking in with whoever came before you. One entry stopped me. The handwriting was shaky, pressed hard into the paper, like whoever wrote it was doing it under stress. The entry was from 11 days before mine. The name was scratched out. Where the planned exit date should have been, they'd written, "It followed me from the ridge." Where the party size field was, they'd written, "Don't stay near the water after dark." I stood there with the register in my hands for a while. It could have been a joke. Plenty of people write strange things in registers. A little gallows humor is basically a backcountry tradition. But the pressure of the pen, the scratched-out name, those things didn't read as jokey to me. They read as someone who was frightened. I took a photo of it on my phone and kept moving. I camped the first 2 nights near water, the way you're supposed to. Nothing unusual. The Weminush is remote, but it's a popular enough route that you see other hikers, and I passed 3 or 4 small parties in the first 2 days. On the 3rd day, the trail thinned out and the people disappeared. I set up camp that 3rd night on a bench above a small lake at around 11,800 feet. It was a beautiful sight, completely open to the sky, good drainage, water 60 yards down the slope. I cooked, cleaned up properly, hung nothing, because at that altitude you use a canister. I was in my tent by 9. I woke up just after midnight. No sound had woken me, at least no sound I could identify. But I was completely awake the moment my eyes opened, the way you get when something trips a wire you didn't know you had. I listened. The lake below was still, no wind. And then, from somewhere across the lake, I heard breathing. Heavy, rhythmic, close enough that the distance bothered me. Across that much open water, at that altitude, you don't hear breathing. You hear it when the source is within maybe 30 feet. I did not move. It lasted maybe 2 minutes. Then it stopped. And then, from the same direction, I heard a voice say something. 2 words, maybe 3. American-sounding English. Not accent, not language, but the rhythm of it was American. I couldn't make out the words. It was pitched low, not a whisper but close to one, like someone talking to themselves. I pressed the SOS button on my InReach and then immediately held it until it deactivated. I didn't know why I did that. Some instinct that told me drawing attention to my location was the wrong move. I lay there until the sky started going gray, and then I packed my tent in the half-dark and moved. I hiked out a day early, took the shortest exit route, came out at a road head near Vallecito Reservoir, sat on my pack in the parking lot until a day hiker couple arrived at 7 in the morning, and I asked them if I could follow their car down the mountain. They were kind about it. Didn't ask too many questions. When I got home, I tried to find out if anyone had reported anything in the Weminush that summer. I found 2 things. A missing person report from late July, a day hiker out of Durango who was never recovered, and a note on a hiking forum from someone who'd done the Pine River route the week after me, saying the trail register at the trailhead had been damaged, like something had bent the metal post and pulled the box partially off. I don't know if those things are connected. I don't know what I heard across the water. I don't know who was across the water. I carry a radio now, not just a GPS. I don't camp near open water alone anymore, and I haven't gone back to the Weminush. But here's the thing that still gets me in the quiet moments before I fall asleep. The register entry said, "Don't stay near the water after dark." I've never figured out how whoever wrote that knew to write that.
This is one of those stories I've been sitting on for a really long time. It happened back when I was maybe 25 or 26, way before I met my wife and way before we had kids. I was a completely different person back then. Not in a bad way, just in the sense that I had the kind of free time and risk tolerance that I genuinely can't relate to anymore. I used to do these solo backpacking trips a few times a year, usually somewhere in the Appalachians. I'd drive out to some remote trailhead, hike deep into the backcountry, way off the trail, and spend a few days completely off the grid. No cell service, no other people, nothing. I loved it. My friends thought I was insane, and honestly, I kind of was. This particular trip was in the Cherokee National Forest, and it changed how I see backpacking forever. I had been out there for 2 days, and everything had been going perfectly. The weather had been great, the trail was quiet, and I hadn't seen another person since the first morning. That changed pretty quickly, though. On the afternoon of the second day, I noticed dark storm clouds building up to the west. I wasn't too worried at first. I'd hiked through rain plenty of times, and it was never a big deal. But within about an hour, I realized it wasn't going to be a passing shower. The wind picked up hard, and the temperature dropped fast enough that I actually stopped to put on another layer. By the time the rain started, I was already looking for a spot to hunker down. The problem was that I was in a pretty exposed section of the trail. As I predicted, it wasn't a light rain. It went from windy to full-on downpour in minutes. The wind was bending smaller trees sideways, and I could hear branches cracking and falling in the canopy above me. I started getting genuinely concerned about my safety. Lightning was striking pretty close by, and I was hiking at elevation with a metal-framed pack on my back. Not ideal. I kept pushing forward, completely soaked at that point. I was scanning the woods on either side of the trail for anything that could pass as shelter. As if by some miracle, I actually saw a structure through the trees off to my left. It was small and dark and partially hidden by the forest, but it was unmistakably man-made. As I got closer, I realized it was a tiny, one-story cabin. They looked extremely old, like it could have been a hunting cabin or a homesteader's shelter from decades ago. There was a single window on the side I was approaching. I can't overstate how relieved I was. I practically sprinted over to the thing and pushed the door open. Inside, it was dim but dry. There wasn't much in there, just a chair, a small table, and what looked like a cot frame pushed against the far wall. There was a stone fireplace on the right side that was clogged with old ash and debris. The place honestly smelled really bad, but I didn't care about anything other than stripping out of my soaked clothes and laying down. There wasn't a couch or anything in there, so I literally just picked a spot on the floor and lied down. I was in survival mode at that point, not exploration mode. All I cared about was that I was out of the storm. It wasn't until I'd been inside for maybe 10 or 15 minutes that I started actually looking around. With the storm raging outside, there wasn't much else to do besides flick on a flashlight and snoop, so that's exactly what I did. There was more stuff in that cabin than I had initially realized. For starters, there was a sleeping bag rolled up in the corner near the cot frame. It didn't look ancient like the rest of the place, which confused me. There were also a couple of cans and water jugs on the table, which made me think someone had been using the place as a base camp of sorts. Maybe another backpacker or a hunter. It wasn't unusual to find stuff like that in remote cabins, but the more I looked around, the more things started bothering me. There were marks on the wall near the door. At first I thought they were just damage from age or weather, but when I got closer to inspect them, I could see they were scratches. There were dozens of them, some shallow and some deeper. There was no pattern or order to the marks, at least not one I could see. I stepped back and looked at the door itself. The handle was a simple latch, which wasn't unusual. Despite the storm, I opened the door just to get a look at the mechanism. There was a metal bracket on the outside of the frame, which looked like it was designed to hold a padlock. The bracket was on the outside. There was no corresponding latch on the inside. That meant the door could only be locked from the outside. Things only got stranger. I shut the door and started looking around the cabin. The only thing I hadn't checked out yet was the window, so I walked over to it. The glass was still perfectly intact, which surprised me given the apparent age of the place. But then I noticed why. There were screws drilled into the window frame, one in each corner securing it shut. Those had also been driven in from outside, and around the edges of the frame on the inside, there were more scratches, deep ones. These were unmistakable. They honestly looked like someone had tried to pry the window open with their bare hands. All of it hit me at once. Someone had been kept in this cabin, trapped, as in kept against their will. I should have left right then, and I did consider that, but there was a good part of me that felt like whatever had gone on in that cabin was well in the past. Everything in the cabin looked really old. Even the sleeping bag, which did look on the newer side, admittedly, was rigid and dusty. Plus, the last thing I wanted to do was go back out in that storm again, so I stayed. I'm not sure how much time passed, maybe an hour, maybe more. The storm wasn't letting up at all. If anything, it had gotten worse. The rain on the roof was so loud that it was hard to hear much of anything else. That's probably why it took me so long to notice the other sound. I picked up on the scratching or scraping noises from outside, somewhere along the left wall of the cabin. At first, I thought it was a branch, but I couldn't remember if there had been branches low enough to even touch the exterior of the cabin. As I was thinking about it, I heard 2 heavy thumps on the porch. They honestly didn't sound like storm sounds. This time I stood up. I did that thing where you freeze in place and try to focus by staring at a random spot on the wall. I was trying to listen, but if someone was moving out there, it would have been impossible to hear over the storm. I started getting paranoid that those sounds I heard were just a few of many, and that the rest had been drowned out by the rain. My eyes drifted over to the window. I couldn't bring myself to look through it. If someone really was out there, they'd probably be looking through it. I stayed in that position for what felt like forever. After a while, I started to relax a bit, thinking I had just been hearing the storm, or at the very worst, an animal poking around the cabin. I was almost ready to forget about everything when I heard something that sent me over the edge. Pressure on the door, like someone was leaning their full weight against it from the other side. The wood creaked and the latch rattled once before the pressure released. My heart rate instantly shot back up, and that's when something clicked. Why would someone be outside in a storm like this, circling the cabin, tapping on the walls, without just coming in? The door wasn't locked, nothing was stopping them, and then I thought about what I'd found inside the cabin, and it occurred to me that maybe whoever was out there didn't want to come inside. Maybe they wanted me to stay inside. Maybe the whole point was to keep me in there. I don't know if that was the right conclusion or if my mind was just spiraling, but I decided I was leaving right then. I didn't care about the storm. I started moving things into my backpack as fast as I could. I had this sickening feeling that something really bad was about to happen, and I was right. The next few moments were a blur. I was maybe 30 seconds from walking out the door when I heard the sound of glass shattering behind me. I spun around just in time to see something come through the window, and that was all I could see before the whole room erupted in flames. The flames spread so fast that I couldn't even process what was happening. 1 second I was standing in a dark room, and the next second the walls were on fire. The heat hit me like a physical wall, and the door wouldn't budge. It was jammed from the outside. I slammed into it with all my might, and it gave. It collapsed off its hinges, and me with it. I scrambled to get back on my feet, and I just ran. I couldn't even see. I was just running wildly through the woods and rain, trying to put as much distance between myself and that cabin. But before I could get a safe distance away, I felt something tackle me from behind, and I was back on the ground. There was a person on top of me, and suddenly I was fighting for my life. I clawed and kicked and screamed, but this guy wouldn't get off me. He was yelling too, and he kept trying to get me in a chokehold. He was gouging at my eyes and pulling my hair, and I started to feel dizzy, but I managed to push him off. I got back up and kept running, and whoever had just tried to kill me was screaming like a maniac. I looked back twice. I couldn't see my attacker, but I did see the cabin, which was fully engulfed in flames. I think the picture of that fireball is burned into my brain forever. The second time I looked back, the glow was smaller but still visible through the woods, but I just kept running. For all I knew, I was being chased. I didn't stop until my legs gave out. I found a spot where a couple of large trees had fallen against each other, and there was a narrow gap underneath that blocked most of the rain. I crawled under there and just collapsed. I couldn't feel my body. I don't know if it was the fire, the rain, or the attack. Maybe all three, but I was completely numb. All I did was sit in that crouched position and try to keep breathing. I don't know how many hours passed under those trees, but time lost all meaning. Eventually, I felt some feelings start to re-enter my body, and I told myself it was move or die. Whoever was out there was probably looking for me, and he couldn't have been that far away. So I got up and started moving through the woods. I didn't know where the trail was, but I didn't really care. I honestly can't tell you how I survived that night, but I did. I stumbled onto a random trail and just followed it. I was soaked and probably bleeding from multiple places, but I just kept trudging on. Eventually, the rain subsided a bit, at least enough for me to figure out where I was. I made it to some random trailhead, and by that point, the storm had passed. I don't remember too much after that. All I remember is that the first person I saw drove me to a hospital. I had second-degree burns on my left forearm and the back of my neck, and doctors told me I was lucky I hadn't inhaled more smoke than I did. None of it was permanent, but it hurt like hell for a long time afterwards. By the time I was healed and safe at home, I told myself I would never camp or hike alone again. Someone had intentionally set that cabin on fire to kill me, That's the only thing that makes any sense. It was pouring rain, a full-blown thunderstorm, and the roof was metal. There's no way a wooden structure goes up like that fast unless the wood had been treated with something beforehand. I gave the police everything, or as much as I could, but I could tell they weren't really going to do anything. And to be fair, I wasn't in a charted part of the woods, so it would have been silly to hound them. The only thing I don't understand is the timing of everything. My wife would probably tell you I stopped doing solo trips because I grew up and got more responsible, and she's not entirely wrong, but I honestly never told her about this incident. And I know I'll never go backcountry trekking again alone.